The ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia has taken many twists and turns, and one of the more recent developments is Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region, reportedly occupying between 770 to 1,200 square kilometers. This bold move has left Russia with a defensive dilemma. How should it respond? The situation is further complicated by Russia's need to manage two fronts: the Kursk incursion in the north and its ongoing operations along the eastern front, particularly around the Avdiivka salient. The broader question we need to ask is, can Russia manage these two fronts effectively? And what are the larger implications of its strategic decisions? Let's begin by analyzing the core dilemma that Russia faces. Defensive line construction. Defensive lines are more than just trenches and fortifications. They are a strategic buffer designed to slow down or stop an advancing enemy. However, constructing them is not as simple as it sounds. Russia now finds itself in a situation where its original defensive line in Kursk has been breached. This leaves Moscow with the challenge of deciding where to build the next line, how far back to place it, and how quickly they can get it up before Ukraine pushes further into Russian territory. This is a classic risk-reward trade-off in military strategy. On one hand, Russia could start constructing a new line as close as possible to the breach, protecting more territory, but exposing the construction crews to Ukrainian fire. On the other hand, they could play it safer and start digging trenches further back, which would give them more time to build without the immediate threat of enemy fire, but would also mean ceding more territory to Ukraine in the meantime. This dilemma isn't unique to the current conflict. It's a theoretical problem that military strategists have wrestled with for centuries. The key issue is always finding the balance between protecting territory and preserving manpower and resources. When it comes to defensive line construction, time is of the essence. Russia does not have the luxury of snapping its fingers and magically erecting a defensive barrier. The process of building these fortifications takes time and resources, and the longer it takes, the more ground Ukraine can gain. This is why Russia is trying to project where Ukraine will be by the time their defensive lines become operational. The longer it takes to build, the further Ukraine can advance. And as Ukraine continues to push into Kursk, the clock is ticking for Russia to build these lines before Kyiv's forces overrun their positions. However, there's another factor in play here that makes Russia's decision even more complicated: the terrain. The geography between Sumy, the staging ground for Ukraine's offensive, and Moscow is vast and varied. The terrain becomes more difficult as you move further into Russia, and this may explain why Russia has chosen to build its new defensive line further back, away from the current front. The current line is situated at a comfortable distance from where Ukrainian forces are, and it appears that the Kremlin has chosen a conservative strategy here. It makes sense given the circumstances. The more difficult the terrain, the more time it will buy Russian forces to complete their fortifications, and it also reduces the risk of Ukrainian forces catching up before the line is ready. One of the most important factors in the location of this new defensive line is the Kursk nuclear power plant. Russia cannot afford to lose control of this critical infrastructure, and it seems clear that Moscow's decision to build a more conservative defensive line further back is partially motivated by the need to protect the plant. In war, critical infrastructure like power plants, water supplies, and transportation hubs are often high-priority targets, and losing them can have devastating consequences for both the military and civilian populations. This is likely why the Kremlin has chosen to play it safe in Kursk by digging its new defensive line at a distance that provides a buffer for the plant and the city of Kursk itself. But even as Russia digs in, Ukraine has been playing a more methodical game. Rather than charging headlong into Russian defenses, Ukraine has opted to move slowly and focus on flanking maneuvers, particularly along the sides of Russia's defensive lines. This allows Ukraine to gain ground without overextending its supply lines, which is a smart move. In warfare, supply lines are the lifeblood of any army. If you extend them too far or leave them vulnerable to enemy attacks, you risk cutting off your troops from vital supplies, reinforcements, and communication lines. By playing it cautiously, Ukraine has managed to gain territory without jeopardizing its logistical support. Russia, on the other hand, seems to be buying time. The conservative placement of its defensive lines suggests that the Kremlin is willing to sacrifice some territory in order to regroup and build up its defenses. This decision may also be influenced by the fact that Russia's best troops are currently engaged on the Eastern Front, particularly in the Donbas region. The war in Ukraine is a two-front conflict for Russia, and managing two fronts simultaneously is always a difficult challenge. In Kursk, Russia is relying on conscripts to hold the line, whereas its more experienced contract soldiers are focused on the Eastern Front, where they have been making slow but steady gains. The situation in Avdiivka is a critical factor in Russia's overall strategy. While Western media has been focused on the Kursk offensive, Russia has been making significant progress in the Donbas region, particularly around the Avdiivka salient. The salient has been a thorn in Russia's side for years, and the fact that it has taken so long for Moscow to capture Avdiivka, despite being right next to Donetsk, speaks to the complexity of the conflict in this region. But now, with a 5-to-1 manpower advantage in some areas, Russia has managed to round out the salient and is making progress toward key logistical hubs like Pokrovsk. Capturing Pokrovsk is crucial for Russia because it is a transportation hub that connects roads and railways. If Russia can capture this city, it will disrupt Ukrainian logistics in the region and make it more difficult for Kiev to resupply its forces. This could give Russia a fleeting window of opportunity to exploit its gains in the region before Ukraine can reorganize its defenses. But as with any salient, there is always the risk that Russia's advance could be flanked. Salients are inherently risky because they extend the front line and create opportunities for the enemy to attack from the sides. If Ukraine can muster enough forces, it could attempt to cut off Russian troops advancing into Pokrovsk, trapping them in a vulnerable position. However, Russia seems to be banking on the idea that it can capture Pokrovsk before Ukraine can mount a serious counteroffensive. This is a high-risk, high-reward strategy, but if it pays off, it could give Russia a significant advantage in the Donbas. The capture of Pokrovsk would not only disrupt Ukrainian logistics, but it would also put pressure on other Ukrainian positions in the region, forcing Kiev to divert resources from other fronts to defend against the new Russian threat. This could relieve some of the pressure on Russia's forces in Kursk, allowing them to focus on fortifying their defensive lines and preparing for a counteroffensive. But even if Russia succeeds in capturing Pokrovsk, it still faces a major challenge: maintaining momentum. The war in the Donbas has been a slow grind, with both sides making incremental gains and suffering heavy casualties. If Russia fails to exploit its gains in Pokrovsk quickly, it risks losing the momentum it has built up over the past few months. This is particularly true if Russia shifts resources away from the Donbas to reinforce Kursk. The longer the conflict drags on, the more difficult it will be for Russia to maintain its gains on both fronts. Another issue for Russia is the simple fact that it lacks the manpower to fight effectively on two fronts. While Russia has a significant numerical advantage in the Donbas, it has had to rely on inexperienced conscripts to hold the line in Kursk. These conscripts lack the training and experience of the contract soldiers fighting in the Donbas, and this has made it difficult for Russia to mount an effective defense in Kursk. Ukraine has been able to exploit this weakness by pushing slowly but steadily into Russian territory, forcing Moscow to divert resources away from the Donbas to shore up its defenses in Kursk. The manpower issue is a critical problem for Russia, but it's not the only one. Another major challenge is the state of the territory itself. War leaves scars, and even if Russia manages to recapture the territory it has lost in Kursk, it may not be usable for a long time. The land will be scarred by the fighting, infrastructure will be damaged or destroyed, and it will take years to rebuild. This is the long-term cost of war, and it's something that Russia will have to contend with even if it manages to push Ukraine out of Kursk. In the meantime, Ukraine has the advantage of holding the land, and even if Russia eventually regains control, the delay will mean that Ukraine can prepare for future offensives while Russia is forced to rebuild. Looking at the broader picture, it's clear that Russia is trying to buy time. The Kremlin's decision to build its defensive lines so far back in Kursk suggests that it is not yet ready to mount a full-scale counteroffensive. Instead, Russia is focusing on consolidating its gains in the Donbas and waiting for the right moment to strike back in Kursk. This is a classic strategy in warfare. When you don't have the resources to fight on two fronts, You prioritize the one where you have the greatest chance of success and delay action on the other until you are in a better position to win. However, this strategy comes with risks. The longer Russia delays its counteroffensive in Kursk, the more entrenched Ukrainian forces will become. And while Russia has made gains in the Donbass, the war there is far from over. If Ukraine manages to stabilize its logistics and mount a counteroffensive of its own, Russia could find itself fighting a two-front war that it can't win. Furthermore, as the conflict drags on, both sides will continue to suffer heavy casualties, and public support for the war may begin to wane. This is particularly true in Russia, where the Kremlin has been careful to downplay the war's costs in its domestic messaging. In the end, the key question is whether Russia's current strategy will pay off. From a purely military perspective, Russia faces an uphill battle. Ukraine has made significant gains in Kursk, and while Russia has made progress in the Donbass, it is unclear whether it can maintain that momentum. Moreover, the broader geopolitical situation is complex. Ukraine's primary goal in this war is to keep Western support flowing, and as long as Kyiv can demonstrate that it is making progress on the battlefield, it will continue to receive arms and aid from its Western allies. If Russia is unable to quickly reverse its losses in Kursk, it risks losing more than just territory. It risks losing the broader war of attrition.